This actually killed Overwatch. May 24th, 2016, Overwatch finally released the full game. Players that got their hands on the beta were incredibly excited, but the full release was like nothing else. Overwatch blew up and took the entire world by storm, becoming one of the most popular games of all time. With a unique roster that had characters that had multitudes of different abilities, different roles that required different skill sets from individual players, Overwatch was Blizzard's attempt at combining MMO elements with FPS gaming, released with a high bar of polish that just made this game a hit. Like, flat out, everyone played Overwatch. Now, to keep the momentum going, Blizzard wanted to turn this game into a competitive offering, and they announced the Overwatch League. They're on franchise league that have teams representing physical locations, such as the Dallas Fuel representing the city of Dallas. Now, the Overwatch League preseason, December 6, 2017, launched the first official games, and it was really hyped. While Overwatch was definitely more on the casual side to start off with, the Overwatch League launched incredibly well and had tons of viewership. Primarily due to just the sheer popularity of the game, people were very interested in how pros played it on the highest level, and the official season of the Overwatch League started January 2018, continuing the success of the preseason even more so. Overwatch was on an absolute tear, popping off in sales records, getting all-time viewership with pro play. Everything was going right for Blizzard at the time, but there was one problem that Blizzard could not quite solve. As the individual skill of players improved, especially at the highest level, communication improved, and there were all these characters that could utilize mobility, Blizzard could not balance dive. Dive was a composition that sent tons of mobility-heavy characters like Genji, Tracer, Winston, and would send them in a coordinated fashion to execute onto enemies in the backline, with the attempt to instantly kill these characters and then use that momentum to continue to snowball on the rest of the enemy team. Now, originally, the majority of people loved Dive as a very hard-to-play composition that required tons of coordination and skill expression. However, after the meta stayed stagnant for too long, some players had dissenting opinions that Dive should probably not be the meta forever, and that there should be some amount of variety. And with the Overwatch League directly making Blizzard want to make sure that the pro scene stays healthy, they had extra pressure put on them to balance Dive appropriately. However, it was very hard to balance. No matter how they would move around certain characters in the meta, it felt like nothing would do it. So instead, they decided to create a character that directly countered Dive, and March 20th, Brig was released. Now, this was a character literally designed to counter Dive. In fact, during its release, Blizzard talked about how this character was a fold to Dive, and that was intentionally created during the design of this character. Now, at face value, this purpose seemed fairly valid. Just because Dive is a fun composition for many, it doesn't mean that it should be the default composition 100% of the time. And perhaps the new introduction of an anti-Dive character will actually balance out the meta a bit, giving some variety to the game. Now, there was really only one problem with this idea. Brig was released absolutely broken. In fact, Brig was most likely the most powerful released character that we've ever seen, and it had much more ramifications just outside of countering Dive. First off, released Brig was freaking insane. 5-second bash that stunned, CC'd a target for 0.9 seconds, and it could stun right through shields. That's right, if you're a Rhine holding up your shield, you could get stunned even when you're holding up that shield, and you could get shattered in the time frame that you were stunned, which was a common strategy of getting stunned as Rhine and then your team getting shattered. In addition to that, you could actually stun Rhines and Dooms out of their charges and out of their punches in a way that now you would end up on the floor, both of you. That was not the case on release. In addition to this, there was a one-shot combo. You heard me right, up against Tracers. A 50 damage stun combined with a 35 damage melee and a 70 damaged whip, which could all be chained together before the Tracer could react, could insta-kill a Tracer. That means if you hit a single stun on a Tracer, you could insta-kill this Tracer every single time. And remember, this was only on a 5-second cooldown. In addition to that, Rally gave every single character 150 armor that were near the Brig for 10 whole seconds. And armor back then was more effective against pellet fire, so characters like Soldier and Tracer did even less damage to armor than they do now, and Brig herself had 400 freaking health where half of it was armor, meaning that Brig was not only unkillable by a Tracer, but unkillable by the majority of the cast, and could even straight up 1v1 tanks when they were rallying. Yes, Brig successfully counter-dived just like Blizzard imagined, but they did not imagine purely how powerful this character would become, because it not only dominated dive, it dominated the entire game. Brig became a character that had an incredible win rate, dominating every single ranked game she was in, and we saw record numbers of players just playing Brig, and just because they would play Brig would just win and win and win, players climbing all the way to the highest ranks of play purely from locking Brig outside of anything else. Imagine a character so powerful that just picking it every game would give you a higher chance of winning than playing whatever you wanted to. Now, this alone wouldn't have potentially threatened Overwatch nearly as bad if the next thing didn't happen. In the Beat Invitational Season 4, which was a small tournament that had a lot of up-and-coming teams, a team specifically with the name of GOATS introduced a composition for the first time in Overwatch history, and that composition became named after the team that created the GOATS composition that actually had 0 DPS. Remember, Overwatch 1 was 6v6, and GOATS included 3 tanks and 3 supports. At the time, this was Brig, Lucio, Moira, D.Va, Zarya, and Rein as the no DPS composition that originally casters and analysts alike thought was a bit of a meme, a bit of a joke, not really that legitimate. I mean, you're not playing any DPS. Everyone knows that you need to have DPS on your team, right? Well, unfortunately, Brig was so powerful that it enabled a composition unlike anything else. A freaking moving 6-man roster that could walk onto anything and insta-delete it, stun it, and murder it out of nowhere, with huge amount of health pools, sustainability to anti-dive, and the power to survive through just about anything together. And very quickly, it was realized that GOATS wasn't just a one-off composition made by a random team. GOATS would quickly take over the entire pro meta, and for a year and a half in the Overwatch League and the World Cup, it became the go-to composition played nearly 95% of the time. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't Blizzard just balance Brig and just completely delete a lot of her abilities and just completely rework the character? Well, you gotta understand that Brig did get nerfed many times, but every single time it was never enough. Blizzard never took any major drastic measures like completely reworking the character, but they did substantially nerf this character many times in a row. However, the pure ceiling of this character on release was so high up that any amount of nerfs didn't really bring this character down to mere mortal levels. It only just brought it down a little bit from its all-time broken peak. Now, the truly interesting thing about the GOATS composition is that this composition was actually fun to watch, at least in the beginning, a composition mainly centered around strategic development and had a lot less to do with mechanical skill with those DPS players on the bench. It was a very interesting composition that took more MMO or MOBA elements as opposed to FPS elements, and while it was definitely interesting to see just how far pro players could take this composition, it ultimately lasted too long, and the dive meta that was so stagnant and that players really wanted to get rid of was replaced by another composition that had an entire role sitting on the sidelines, and it was definitely a frustrating aspect. In the pursuit of breaking down stagnation, ended up creating a composition that was all powerful and eliminated an entire role, creating even more stagnation and less variety. Now, what actually killed GOATS? There are a lot of things that could be given to killing GOATS ultimately. The bash through the shield got nerfed and removed. The damage from the shield bash got nerfed all the way down to 5 damage instead of 50. Armor got nerfed. The speed boost on Lucio got nerfed. Tons of DPS buffs, a Discord nerf, a DM nerf, and pros got better at 3 to 4 DPS comps, but ultimately all those things weren't necessarily enough. Eventually, September 1st, 2019, Warlock was released that put 2 tanks, 2 DPS, and 2 supports on every single team mandatory and gave separate ranks for every single one of them. Now, this was a very heavily controversial opinion for several reasons. One, Warlock limits the creativity that players had up to this point. We saw a multitude of compositions that rocked 3 DPS, or 1 DPS, or some variety in between. There was pretty much unlimited creativity before Warlock, and some tanks like Hammond actually operated better as a solo tank, and it seemed like it was very weird to force everyone into this 2-2-2 purely because we couldn't balance around a character that was very broken from release and we never really got a handle on balance, so role lock often felt like a band-aid solution. Even worse than this problem, with the role lock system, we found that DPS queues, especially with the game becoming slightly less popular, became longer and longer, with sometimes DPS players having to wait 10, 20, 30 minutes for a game. Once again, it made DPS players feel like they were getting punished for something when just not too long ago, they weren't even in the optimal meta composition, and now they have to wait a ridiculous amount of time to play any games. In addition to that, tank players would get very fast queues, but they would be very imbalanced because there wasn't enough tanks, so a tank player at high rank would get thrown into a low rank lobby, or vice versa, and the whole system was a mess at this point, with the ever fading popularity of the game. And especially when Blizzard stopped developing new things for Overwatch 1 to shift their development to Overwatch 2, the game faltered and these problems became worse and worse. Now, all these reasons are ultimately why many people blame Brig for the death of Overwatch 1 and ultimately the shift to Overwatch 2, because Brig not only took over the pro meta, destroyed the pro scene, or at least changed it fundamentally, and eventually created the role lock system. This all led to the inevitable downfall of Overwatch 1, and it mainly came due to the fact that Brig was released and then never properly balanced, and Blizzard took a completely different route into actually nerfing this character fully. Now, in Overwatch 2, Brig actually just fully lost the stun, at least until recently. Now Brig has the stun back on her ultimate, which definitely is going to scare a lot of people, primarily due to PTSD and just the remembrance of just how dominant Brig was. Many who didn't live through it don't understand just how scary this character was and just how frustrating it could be that one single character completely destroyed one of the most popular metas that we've ever seen and potentially hurt Overwatch 1 in a way that can never be recovered. Now, at this point, Brig is in a fairly balanced state, but looking back on it, it makes you wonder whether or not Blizzard actually regrets creating Brig in the first place. I don't think there's a single instance of a character being introduced in a game that had such a huge impact over the development and design of the game for the foreseeable future, just like Brig did, and Brig's legacy, for better or for worse, will be cemented in Overwatch's history. But if you enjoyed the content, smash that like and subscribe, and let me know what piece of Overwatch history you want to hear about next in the comments down below.